I think it should be phrased somewhat differently, is we will take over some of these functions because they're critical to our commercial needs and activities, but you, government, need to step aside.
In a joint media statement by the Presidency, Business for South Africa and Business Unity South Africa released last week, a, quote, partnership initiative was announced that aims to bring to bear expertise from the private sector to help assist government in resolving all sorts of issues. Joining me to discuss the potential pitfalls as well, is the CEO of the Free Market Foundation, David Ansara. David, thanks very much for joining us on the CRA channel. A bit of a reversal here in terms of what our audience might be used to, but we're very much looking forward to getting your expertise, your insight on the specific topic. So just in a nutshell, tell us a little bit about what the initiative is, at least on paper, then we can get into what it might mean in action.
Hi, Chris. Well, it's good to be back on the CRA channel, albeit in a different capacity. And I'm very glad that I don't have to do all of these interviews like you do. It's a lot of hard work, so we appreciate it. But essentially, this partnership initiative is a classic case of stakeholder engagement writ large. So the government has essentially convened this shared forum between business and itself. And there are three so-called priority work streams. There's the energy crisis, there's transport and infrastructure. That's number 2. And then number 3 is crime and security. And essentially what the government is proposing is to leverage private sector expertise. There are crises in all 3 of these respective areas. And what I think is driving this is a sense from business that it wants to see a resolution to some of these problems. And I think that this is well intentioned in many respects, but essentially the risk here for business is that it is playing according to the tune that is being set by government. And actually, we saw Mr. Ramaphosa reprimanding business in this forum, particularly with regards to the intelligence dossier that was authored by Andre de Ruyter and was sponsored by some of these business associations. And Mr. Ramaphosa took umbrage to that and blamed that for the fraying relations between business and government. Meanwhile, government is imposing on South Africa's economy a raft of hostile laws. The NHI bill is being deliberated upon this week in Parliament that will seek to nationalize healthcare. There's the expropriation without compensation proposal. That legislation has also gone to the NCOP, the National Council of Provinces. Moreover, we have ratcheting up of race-based laws, the Employment Equity Amendment Bill being the latest iteration of that, which will really severely undermine the ability of ordinary South Africans to seek work in a climate of low economic growth and diminishing economic opportunity. So on the one hand, government is saying, well, please, business, come to assist us. We have all of these so-called challenges. Then on the other hand, battering the economy with these really nonsensical laws.
And David, you mentioned sort of business engaging on government's terms, maybe being the recipient the whole time of the signals that government sends. On the one hand, one wants to push for reform, I think, from within, as it were. So if you get these opportunities, you try and push there. But where do you think the line should be, as it were? Do you follow that there should be a point where business sort of walks away, or is it always useful to be part of those avenues of engagement? Where do you think, it's easy to say big business, but let's say bigger businesses, where they should maybe decide, this far and no further?
Well, I think organized business, big businesses' approach and its strategy has been, let's convene around the table, let's use access to government to try and influence policymakers. And that may have been a suitable strategy at some point, but I think we need to acknowledge that this strategy is no longer working. Its supposed influence is not actually having an effect on government policy. I think also if it was merely the case that government was incapacitated and incapable of delivering these services, like, for example, energy, transport and infrastructure, and crime and security, that the government was just hapless and needed help, then you could make a case that business could step in to fulfill some of those functions. But we have a context of overtly hostile, ideological driven policy that is actively undermining business interests, which in the long term is really going to diminish economic opportunity for those very businesses. So I think business is stuck in a kind of short-term bargaining mindset, trying to extract small concessions, but is losing sight of the bigger picture. And the bigger picture is an increasingly hostile business environment. So I think business needs to recognize its significant bargaining power. The only reason that anything works in South Africa is because of the private sector. And it can also withhold its support in exchange for concessions from the government. At the moment, the government is dictating the terms. So I think, there is definitely a role to be played for increased privatization of state-owned enterprises. I mean, if you look at Transnet, there's no reason why the private sector could not run some of those critical arterial routes that form the backbone of South Africa's transport infrastructure. You could have public-private partnerships or concession agreements where a private entity essentially runs that asset and has an offtake agreement. You can structure that pretty easily. And I think there is a role to be played for business to say, let us take over some of these functions. But I think it should be phrased somewhat differently, is we will take over some of these functions because they're critical to our commercial needs and activities, but you, government, need to step aside. And I think that is a mindset shift that needs to take place. That is business recognizing its bargaining power and actually utilizing that leverage to achieve an outcome that is more beneficial for it and also for the economy at large.
And David, just a final question then in the context of a general election next year, which should happen, I think, within the next 12 months, maybe by the end of June. It might be a little bit later, but at least I think by August at the latest next year. In terms of what this might sell in the short term is, from government side, we're being pragmatic, we're engaging. This almost legitimizes the route that South Africa has been on, and that route might be 0.4% growth like we had in the first quarter. I mean, nothing compared to the decline we had in the fourth quarter of last year. So in that broader context, does this sort of legitimize maybe from business side what government is engaging in on the policy space, and the risk then that, now government can say, in the elections next year, business has engaged with us and continue voting for us?
Yeah, business has traditionally been a bit reluctant to wade into political affairs. And I think there is some legitimacy to that. And I think what we've seen, particularly during the Ramaphosa era, the so-called New Dawn, is that significant role players within business and finance galvanized around a particular individual and his faction. And I think the great risk of that was when that individual and his faction did not deliver the promised reform. Then now suddenly the tide is out and you can see who's been swimming naked. And, I think getting involved in particular factional battles within the tripartite alliance is a very bad idea. And I think business should be very cautious about doing so. However, it can engage in political contestation in the sense of the accumulation and application of power. So that is different from picking a partisan favorite and sticking with them come hell or high water. So I would say that a business should not be apolitical. It should definitely see its political role, but it should be non-partisan. And I think that is a good way of maintaining its neutrality and its impartiality. And I think that strategy, a more firm posture, a more robust approach to policy issues that are going to very directly and negatively impact on South Africa's economy, I think that would be a much more favorable strategy.
Thank you very much for watching. Let us know in the comments below your thoughts on the Partnership Initiative. What good do you think it might come from it, or potentially what the pitfalls might be? Before you leave, a reminder please to like this video, and also if you haven't yet, subscribe to our YouTube channel. Until next time, this has been Chris Hattingh for the Centre for Risk Analysis. Take care.